I'm going live, so please don't say anything. Okay, well, good morning to folks watching on YouTube. This is a live watch party for Portland City Council today, January 27. We're going to be watching the Joint Terrorism Task Force. Okay, well, good morning to folks watching on YouTube. This is a live watch party for Portland City Council today, January 27. Sorry about that echo. This is Dan Handelman with Peace and Justice Works in our project group, Portland Copwatch. We are the ones who actually found the Joint Terrorism Task Force on the City Council's consent agenda in the year 2000 and pulled it off to discuss it. 5 years later, in 2005, the city got out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force, which is an FBI-run task force that does, we think, political surveillance improperly. And the city of Portland got back into the Joint Terrorism Task Force in 2011 after the FBI set up a young Somali immigrant in a fake bombing plot. And then in 2019, the city got out of the Joint Terrorism Task Force again. So today is a required annual report under that resolution that got us out that the Bureau has to give every year in January. And we are not allowed to speak to City Council because of Mayor Wheeler's decision. I'm going to introduce you to the other people who are going to be on with you today while Mayor Wheeler is doing his introductions. This is Brian King from Portland DSA. Wave hello, please. And then this is Carol Landsman from Jewish Voice for Peace Portland. There you are, Carol. Okay, thank you. And so the council clerk is doing introductions. They're going to probably give some ground rules about what to do. So yesterday we held a news conference outlining some of our concerns about this report. We also, some of the groups involved in this campaign, we've been working on this for a very long time, put out a people's report about the Joint Terrorism Task Force in January with 7 questions we wanted the city to answer. And we got inadequate answers to those in a document that's stapled to the, well, not stapled, but attached to the City Council document with the Bureau's JTTF report. So yesterday we raised some concerns about the content of the report, the content of those answers, and that is streaming on the Peace and Justice Works YouTube page. So if you're watching along here, it's the live video that was posted yesterday, and you can watch that back for more information. Does anybody else have anything to add while we're waiting for council to get started?
Yes, I just wanted to mention, and maybe Brian would mention too, why JVP and DSA are involved in this issue. Jewish Voice for Peace works to end Islamophobia, and the Joint Terrorism Task Force is a terrible, terrible committer of Islamophobia. Brian?
Sure, thanks. Portland DSA got involved in 2018, and the big concern, of course, is similar to JVP, is that the JTTF targets Muslim and Arab communities unjustly and really causes a lot of harm in those communities. And they also target protests like racial justice protests and conflate genuine protest with terrorism, and so it really endangers people who are speaking up for justice.
Great, thanks. There's so we do have a backup team here who's feeding us information of what we might want to remember to tell the audience. And DSA stands for Democratic Socialists of America. As I said, we've been involved in this campaign for a while, and I think one of the things that is of concern that one of the reasons that council might have been predisposed to get out of the JTTF in 2019 is that Donald Trump was the president, and the FBI and the Department of Justice were headed up by people who were unfriendly to progressive activism. But our concern is more broad than that. Our concern is that no matter who's in the White House, no matter who's running the Department of Justice, this, structurally speaking, the FBI and this Joint Terrorism Task Force are predisposed to targeting communities of color and progressive activists and immigrants and other people who are vulnerable. And even though there has been some activity by the FBI to investigate, like the marauders that went to the Capitol earlier this month, that doesn't do away with the FBI's long history of doing things like interning Japanese Americans during World War II. And that's one of the reasons the Japanese American Citizens League has been part of our efforts too for these many years. So the mayor is explaining now why the city council is meeting remotely. I think that, as I said, the city attorney is probably going to read some ground rules. The city council is probably going to do their consent agenda, but that's all going to be happening quickly. So please keep watching our stream. So one of the other things we talked about a little bit yesterday was how Mayor Wheeler has said to the press or the media that he is thinking about trying to loosen up the restrictions on the Portland police from gathering information about people. They were trying to live stream, or actually did live stream protests during the summer, and the ACLU sued to stop them from doing that. That's because there's a state law, ORS 181A.250, which prohibits collection of information on people's religious, social, or political affiliations without any suspicion of criminal conduct. And that's wholly the basis of our efforts to get Portland out of the JTTF. And the ACLU helped create that law in the early 80s after some police spying was revealed. So the mayor saying that he wants to loosen the rules in order to make it easier for the police to gather that information is an indication that he wants to weaken that law, and that's something that we're hoping the people watching along at home will help join us in saying no, that we need those strong protections, and there are already laws against, breaking into the Capitol or whatever kinds of property damage were being done by protesters who were doing it, but the protesters who are simply out in the street expressing their First Amendment rights shouldn't be getting spied on, having their information collected by the police.
Hey, Dan, I think
Yes.
some commenters made a good point about the mayor wanting to increase penalties against repeat offenders, and they've said, Reverend Martin Luther King was arrested dozens of times, and it was really that high number of arrests is really an indictment of the system, not of Martin Luther King. And the same thing here is when people are protesting for justice, the number of arrests against them is really an indictment of the system.
Thanks a lot. First up is item number 44.
Agreed. All right, so now they're announcing our agenda item.
Colleagues, item 44 is a report from the Police Bureau regarding Portland Police Bureau's cooperation with the Joint Terrorism Task Force following the formal withdrawal from the task force in May of 2019. Before we hear from the Bureau, since this is the first time some of you will have heard this report, I want to share a comment about procedure. There are 4 primary types of items that this council hears: ordinances, resolutions, reports, and proclamations.
So I think he's going to explain why he's not taking testimony.
Reports. So we're not taking testimony on this item. This is a practice intentionally set by previous. He established that when he came into office. The city code allows the presiding officer to take testimony. And just so you know, the other 4 commissioners can override that, but the only way for that to happen now that we're on COVID is for them to vote now, and then we're not on that Zoom call, so we wouldn't be able to testify anyway because we're not physically in City Hall. We take that different approach intentionally so that we have a way to officially record.
Well, he also says that they don't want to take a political approach to this, but of course, every decision about testimony is political. Whether you accept them all or pick and choose, it's all a political decision.
Joint Terrorism Task Force.
So now he's saying that the council's not going to do a vote on whether or not to accept the report, which is also baloney, because they always take a motion to whether to accept the report or not.
Has clear guidelines on when it can partner.
And one of our commenters also said he sounds a little defensive, which I think is probably true.
Resolution 37424 and Portland Police Bureau Directive 750.00 spell out the specific parameters of that engagement and cooperation. We have Assistant Chief Michael Leisure and Sergeant Pete.
Why do you think he's so opposed to actual citizen input?
To share information from last year based.
Well, I'm not going to say which commissioner it was, but we talked to one commissioner's office about the idea of doing public testimony, and they said, oh, you know, people just get on and they always say the same thing over and over again. And I don't, even if that's true, it's the city's job to listen. And even if that's true, they can also set a time limit of how long they want to take and say, we're only going to take the first 10 people, or they can say, we're only going to take 1 minute from each person. I think that is a very bad attitude in terms of promoting democracy.
Oh, it's a terrible attitude when Portland is supposed to be a beacon of community involvement.
Yeah.
Well, you can also say that people say the same thing over and over again because city council does nothing.
Right,
Good point.
The same issues every year. So Chief Lavelle is introducing somebody.
I just wanted to say.
Oh, that was Mike Leisure, the assistant chief.
The FBI. We're living in a turbulent time right now. Violent extremism is on the rise.
All right, so the chief is talking about the turbulent time we live in, and this is the entire closing section of the Bureau's report is kind of a commercial for why we need to be aware of terrorism and investigate people. And a lot of the things they cite are not any serious threats. They cited the kidnap plot for the Michigan governor, which involved several undercover FBI people. Is that right, Brian?
Yeah, there were agents and informants. I think there were like 2 agents and 2 informants involved in the plot.
Well, I just read that the head of the Proud Boys is an FBI informant.
Oh, yeah.
I read that.
I think that.
I just read that this morning.
Wow.
It's sort of like the Communist Party in the 40s and early 50s. Sometimes there were so few people in it that the entire leadership were FBI agents.
I realize that 3 of you are new to the council.
So this is Sergeant Pete Simpson, who's the head of the Criminal Intelligence Unit, which is where the 2 officers who have the clearance, the security clearance to be part of the JTTF are. Brian, do you want to tell people a little bit about Sergeant Simpson?
He's also in charge. He's also the secretary at the, let's see, what is it called? A law enforcement training agency, and I don't have the name for it right now.
Okay. Yeah, he used to be the vice president of the Portland Police Association as well, and he edited their newsletter and said very nasty things about members of the public. And then he was the public information officer for a while.
Yeah, it was American Society for Industrial Security. So this is like a training association for law enforcement and security professionals.
When and how this work can be done. Every member of the organization has to read.
So somebody in the chat said that the resolution says that they're going to have a directive for public review, that's actually open for public review until this Friday. If you look at the Bureau's website and go to the directives area, it's a policy that guides how the PPB interacts with the JTTF, and it's based on the resolution, but Portland Copwatch is going to submit comments saying that both the resolution and this directive should be stronger.
Well,
And,
we should not have any interaction with the JTTF. The FBI is not our friend.
Right, and several people involved in the campaign spoke to City Council during what's called the communications in early October. 5 different people gave reasons why we should pull all the way out of the JTF, and they didn't do anything about it. On our splash screen today was a picture of former Attorney General Bill Barr telling the police telling the Joint Terrorism Task Forces around the country to investigate instigators and organizers around the Black Lives Matter movement. And that is one of the main reasons we thought the city should have taken action last year to completely cut ties. Because he's saying there were a total of 6 cases. And Brian, do you have an outline about those 6 cases?
Yeah, there were 4 that, let's see, went from PPB to the FBI. No, from the FBI to the PPB. And basically, they were all not criminal offense, except for one that they already had known about, so that the interaction with JTTF really didn't add any information. There was one arrest from that. And they were all were white males. And the important thing about that is I think there's a lot of scaremongering about Islamophobic scaremongering about terrorism being international terrorism, and we've seen in the last two reports the reality is it's basically empty threats by white people against each other in Portland.
The nature of those cases.
Yeah, and it's pointed out that the FBI's level of reasonable suspicion is not as high. I mean, that's actually a legal term, so I shouldn't even have said it. But they can open what's called an assessment on basically a little bit more than a hunch. So when they were, and it's not clear to me, the case that Brian's talking about is a case where there was an assault that happened at one of the protests this summer. I'm not clear how that was deemed terrorism at all, why the FBI, through the JTTF, was informing the city about that. It's just like, it was an assault, and that's a crime already, if we said already.
And so, in this case of the bomb threat that shut down the criminal Justice Center, that's one of the arrests that they made of a person in Washington. But there was no bomb here. This was again an empty threat.
The report only mentions, I think, a total of 10 cases, and I'm positively gobsmacked that there are only 10 when they were living in the city, downtown Portland, for months.
Well, I mean, I'm hoping that that's true, that they didn't assume there were more cases that were terrorism. But the answers that the Bureau gave to our questions included one that said that they did do some investigations during the protest this summer, and they said it wasn't because of Attorney General Barr. But the point is, if they did those investigations as some form of terrorism, then they did do it because of Barr. Because why else would the JTTF be involved in protest actions in the streets of the city of Portland?
Yeah, this is what I want to. This is the one question I want to watch here is like you said, they were involved in some investigations on the protests, and what was the justification for that? Because there are limited justifications in the resolution, including threat to life, and this threat to life has been used multiple times to shut down protests. So was it some trumped up interpretation of threat to life that got the JTTF involved in investigating protesters?
One case that remained open from.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. A commenter says, white males make wild, dangerous statements. We talk to them, not identify a threat, case closed. So, yeah, it is definitely a two-tiered system at least, where certain people, Jeremy Christian, who killed 2 people and injured one very seriously on a MAX train, was taken into custody very peacefully. Was allowed to finish an alcoholic beverage he was drinking, and if he had been a person of color, he probably would have been killed.
It's very limited in the flow of information, so that it must go through the Criminal Intelligence Unit to the JTTF, and from there back through.
So he's talking about how the resolution limits how the information comes into the Bureau and how it goes back to the FBI, and it's still. So, for instance, this summer when the Portland police officers were deputized, another thing that we raised in our report, that if an officer was asked by an FBI agent, what do you know about that guy there who's protesting? Oh, yeah, I know him. He hangs with this crowd, and this is the group that he's part of. That is not information that the FBI has the right to get, especially if it's not criminal. There's not a criminal investigation involved. So I think that there are a bunch of questions about the cooperation between the Portland police and agencies, the FBI and other agencies that were in our streets this summer, and whether that was in violation of our state law.
For the life of me, I do not understand why we need FBI in Portland. The only reason that I can think of is the 2010 horrible case with the young Somali man, Mohammed Mohamud, who was, I say, groomed, much the same way as a sexual predator would groom someone. The FBI groomed him to take action in the way they did. The next year we rejoined the JTTF. And I'm wondering if that whole brouhaha, that's not the right word, if that whole horrible action was so that we would rejoin. And now a young man spends years
he's been
in jail.
Yeah, he's in jail for 20 years, and I have no doubt that was partly what they were thinking when they did the setup. I just want to make sure that we're still listening to Simpson. He's talking about how the officers have to follow the state law, but we don't know who's overseeing that. The mayor does not have the security clearance to know exactly what's going on because the FBI won't give it to him because he's a civilian. And that's one of the reasons that Tom Potter got out of the JTF in 2005. It was a former police chief who was our mayor. All right, so he's talking about he talked about the incident where somebody was accused in Troutdale of being involved in material support to ISIS, the Islamic State, and that was another one of those things where that person didn't actually do anything substantial, but they made a big deal out of it. They claimed that the Portland police said the criminal intelligence unit had nothing to do with that arrest, but they didn't say whether any other Portland officers might have been involved.
That is something we are paying close attention.
And now they're using the term domestic terrorism, and this is something that we need to emphasize. We can't emphasize enough that there don't need to be any more laws. We don't need to, rebrand. The word terrorism gets thrown around a lot, and a lot of our allies in the community rightfully say when there's a white person that's shooting up at people of color, they don't call it terrorism. That's not to say that we should use the word terrorism more. I think terrorism is a very loaded term, and it comes from the perspective of usually people in power. In the chat, it says the Troutdale individual was in a wheelchair, and basically the investigation was based on web posts.
Well, I thought about the Troutdale one. I think the two things he did was set up social media, allegedly set up social media for ISIS, and provided some documents on knife fighting. And I thought that was odd because you can get multiple documents on the knife fighting from the U.S. Army, for example, online. So I don't know why anyone would need to be provided with knife fighting techniques unless translating it into Arabic counts as terrorism now.
Yeah. So Commissioner Hardesty's talking now, and she's challenging Simpson why he didn't talk more about the white supremacist violence that was happening in Portland in the last year. Again, I think what she's hinting at is because the FBI and the Portland police aren't interested in squashing white supremacist violence because they're part of a white supremacist system that keeps the structures in place that we already have. I mean, I'm not saying that they're necessarily, they're not personally in the Klan or something like that. I'm just saying that structurally speaking, institutionally speaking, these systems were set up to perpetuate white supremacy.
Also, in the last year's report, I mean, they really took pains to underplay the white supremacist violence. Would say, oh, those were lone actors; they had no connections to anybody. But we've seen over the last year that that's not true. There's international networks of white supremacists who incite each other and we saw that the effect of that in the January 6th insurrection in the Capitol.
Chats or groups that are inspiring each other and essentially radicalizing each other into doing mass violence.
Yeah, he's talking about that now. Okay, they're radicalizing each other online. I didn't see how he started this.
We do look at every hate crime report that comes in. We review those.
Yeah, well, so the question is what are the police doing to monitor social media? That was another question we raised about whether they're investigating people based on social media, and they said yes, when there's a criminal act we do. But how do they define criminal act? What is the threshold? And in fact, a person who worked at the Civil Rights Division in the state of Oregon got spied on for putting up a Public Enemy logo because they thought that it was a call to violence.
Well, what's information that's coming out now is that the FBI must have known about the planning for the insurrection. It was largely planned online or in chat groups that law enforcement were involved in, and yet they did nothing. So this is the question about new tools needed when all the information and tools needed to stop plots was available in this case, and they simply didn't. And this is a huge issue of bias by the FBI.
The question
Mr.
I
Hardy?
want answered
Can you hold on a
is-
second, Carol? They're
Oh,
asking
sure.
a question that from the ACLU right now. They're asking about training. Okay. All right. Why don't you go ahead, Carol?
Okay, I'm hard pressed to understand what we get from coordination with the FBI. Can anyone tell me what the benefit of the Joint Terrorism Task Force is to Portland?
Yeah, well, I think they have their own idea that they're keeping people safe, but I don't think that's true.
And it all goes
So
back to 2010.
Yeah. Yeah. So, Sergeant Simpson is saying that they're getting training from the Anti-Defamation League, which is actually has its own set of problems, and they were involved in the spy scandal in the 90s that we have paperwork on. If you look at the archives of the Portland Copwatch newsletter, the People's Police Report, or the Portland Tribune, if you want to go to mainstream sources, there was a huge scandal that involved the Anti-Defamation League.
The Anti-Defamation League also has a program in which it pays for police officers to go to Israel to be trained by the military in ways that the IDF, the Israel Defense Force, oppresses Palestinians. They're teaching our officers how to oppress minorities. That's the Anti-Defamation League for you.
Yeah, well, in the spy scandal, they had like a folder labeled pinkos for people who they thought were communists. So this is just kind of the way those went. All right, it looks like Commissioner Hardesty's talking again.
Reached out and you declined, and I guess that's a question for
He's asking whether the Terrorism Task Force reached out and the PPB declined. And right, so he's deferring to the chief because the chief is the one who decides whether or not to pass information on or not.
Was there any time that you were called by the JTTF over the last year that you declined?
Let's see. I think the report indicated that they basically took all the things, and then when they found no criminal conduct, they just didn't go any further with them. But let's see what he has to say.
They reached out to us, and I think sometimes these cases are in the very, very early stages. But of the four, I don't recall defamation on my part.
Thank you. I guess I do have one more question. So the report that you presented.
So yeah, at the very early stage, the question is whether it's an assessment, that is what I was talking about before, a hunch, or whether there's actually any criminal conduct.
To make this process better so that Portland police are not investigating something that ultimately is not criminal behavior.
Yeah, and
Good question. How they investigate to make sure they're not investigating somebody that's not a criminal.
Was already known. So the other three cases turned out not to be, criminal investigation, and I think it's a good thing we're getting the reports, meaning that there are people in the community that are very in tune with threats and people posting things or concerns about people talking about violence and racial.
Yeah, there's a limit to if you see something, say something, though. Especially because we've seen all the Karens around the country calling in when they just see somebody who doesn't look like them.
So I don't think it's a bad thing that we determined there was no crime. We did the investigation. It's showing that.
And in the chat, we're seeing that Simpson's not saying whether or not the initial information turned over them even alleged any criminal activity.
Times in the next year because
Oh, good question.
Needs to be done, and the preliminary information on
what happens to the files
warrants
when they turn out not to be criminal?
Fact gathering phase.
Yeah, that's a great question. We've asked that question a long time. We got spied on at Peace and Justice Works. We got spied on twice by the Portland police. Once was in the early 90s. Ended up in a case called Squirrel versus Moose. It was actually Squirrel versus City of Portland, but Chief Moose was in place, so everybody called it Squirrel versus Moose. And the city was held accountable for that, and they had to purge their files because of it, because they were keeping information they shouldn't have. And then I personally was spied on in 1998 after the U.S. bombed Iraq, and they put my name in a file connected to people who got arrested at a protest, even though I was listed specifically as a non-criminal suspect, and that my lawsuit against them was thrown out on technicality. And we have no idea what they did with those files.
And in these reports, we don't have information about some of these more serious sounding threats that were referred from PPB to the FBI, because we don't have those demographics in the report. And there's threats like, oh, someone said they were going to bomb a mosque, and you're saying, well, what happened with that? We would really like to know. Was that closed, or was that a real case, or what happened?
Right, and they're talking a little bit about that now, about how Simpson's saying they're not allowed to talk about cases that haven't finished. There was a case that was in last year's report, 1 year ago, that they said they couldn't report on because it was still open, and in this year's report they said it's still not closed, and they're probably going to report on it in 2022.
That's all I have, Mayor.
Thank you, Commissioner Hardesty. Any other questions?
And I think these cases show that the big difference between the reality and the perception. When this was a closed process, when we were in the JTTF, we had no information. The FBI took commissioners into closed sessions to tell them their story about the threats they were hearing. But when we see the report, the threats are really not credible.
Yeah. Oh, here's Commissioner Rubio, who I haven't seen as a commissioner yet.
And then see that multi-jurisdictional partnerships are complex and also necessary to solving the problems that we face, especially in the light of recent events at the Capitol, both here and in DC. But we must do so in a way that ethically aligns with our values of anti-racism and abolishing xenophobia and racial violence. And now with this new
sounds like she's making comments that are appropriate.
Our role in council is to hold ourselves and those
I should point out, too, that we sent out a questionnaire that had a question about the Joint Terrorism Task Force, and Commissioner Rubio, in that time, last year, said she thought we should get fully out of the JTTF. Commissioner Mapps, on the other hand, said he was okay with it case-by-case basis. So we'll hear what he has to say when it's his turn.
And also, Commissioner Ryan said there was no possible way we should be cooperating with the JTTF in his questionnaire. Don't remember his exact wording, but it was something like that, just no cooperation.
Ryan?
Yes, good morning.
So Commissioner Ryan.
Mayor,
now we'll find out.
Setting the stage, it was very helpful for being one of the newer members of council, and just have a better sense of what the process is about. And onboarding is ongoing when you're new, and just hearing the 4 different types of items we bring to the council is actually very helpful. Also, thank you, Chief LaBelle and Sergeant.
Yeah, we got to really push about this. Reports are allowed to have public testimony issue, because we talked to him about that, and I think he still doesn't get it. The mayor's spreading a falsehood about the fact that you're not supposed to take public testimony reports. It is his decision, and his previous comment was he said that because he didn't want to have to pick and choose which ones got him.
So why not all of them?
And the attention of law enforcement, no matter how big or small.
What did you say, Carol?
At the same time, our cities.
Why does there have to be a pick and choose? There's a report, there should be public testimony.
Especially black.
Right. Well, it may be just something that's very perfunctory that doesn't generate public interest. But yeah, that could be the other way around. Exactly.
So it sounds like Commissioner Ryan here is coming down on the extremism. Everything is extremism, and we have to crack down on it, and we need to be in deal with these threats.
The FBI is often troubled involvement.
Right. And earlier in the chat, I didn't get to it, but one of the commenters said, while it's encouraging there's more focus on white supremacy, there's language in the report about lone wolf actors, and it's reminiscent, he said, of the Bush era Islamophobia, where they sort of blame everything on Muslims and immigrants and so forth.
Black people.
The nature of our relationship.
And people of color, yeah.
I would hope that
I go back to my original, well, not my original point, but one of my points, which is, what does the JTTF do for Portland?
Continuing to learn from the community members on this topic. I really appreciate those who reached out.
What do we get out of it?
And collaborating with my colleagues on this.
Right. Well, I think it's more what the FBI gets out of us, that they get on the ground. They say that all the time about how they get on the ground information. Oh, well, the Commissioner Ryan just voted yes.
Mueller?
Aye. The report's accepted. Thank you all for the presentation.
So I have to think that it's largely a power grab for law enforcement, and using the term terrorism scares people, and they keep control of they want to keep control of the information, and this gives them more power. And I'm sure in their minds that that's just tools to use, but we know how those are misused, and it's a power grab.
The whole
Right,
report, my reading of the report suggested it was useless and it was a PR piece for the police. One of the things that really annoyed me was their phrase in their mission statement that one of their duties is to eliminate fear of crime, which means that they should support every single Karen. And Kevin, what's the male equivalent of a Karen in the world? Oh well, the report was useless.
No, I hear you. I hear you. For those of you watching on YouTube, the hearing is over. We're going to do a little bit of wind down commentary here, and then we'll end the live stream. But we do appreciate everybody watching today. And one of the things that that they didn't talk about was the issue of cell phone surveillance that we know happened. The Nation magazine reported on it, that Portlanders were spied on. The Bureau just simply said we didn't do anything. We didn't participate in that. Do you have anything, any wrap-up thoughts, Brian, and then Carol?
Well, about their surveillance, I mean, there's multiple things that they can do to a cell phone. So they said in the report, we didn't do the things that they talked about in the Nation article, which was cell phone cloning, I believe. But there's other things. Once you have physical possession of a device, that there's other things you can do to get information off of that phone. So the Portland police do own $100,000 worth of cell phone forensics equipment, and they did take possession of cell phones during protests. So there's a lot of things that aren't answered in this answer here.
Carol?
Well, remember that the Supreme Court has said that it's illegal to look into people's cell phone data unless you have a search warrant. I don't know if that makes any difference at all. Portland out of JTTF, it's terrible.
And the other question we didn't talk about was the one where we asked, was the involvement of all these JTTF agencies in the downtown protests, the interaction between Portland police and these other agencies, did that violate the resolution that was passed? And it's really hard to say. One of the reasons these task forces are dangerous is because they really override local authority, over local oversight over policing in the city, and so we don't really know what happens with this stew of different acronyms policing downtown.
One of the commenters is talking about the JTTF grants power to feds to increase local policing and presence. The JTTF is contrary to a notion of balance of powers. What is the feds' role in state government and in state policing issues?
Right, and also they're talking about how they're using the term, violent extremists, and they imply that the anti-fascists are some kind of political extremists, and they use the term racially based violent extremists, which is a new term on me, but it's just all very.
What does that mean?
Couched. I think it's a couched phrase because the FBI doesn't want to use the term white supremacist, and the Portland police don't want to use the term white supremacist. But that's what it is when they say racially. Because when they say racially based, it sounds like they could be applying that to somebody who doesn't like white people. But really, racism is power and privilege plus bias. So that's even if there's people of color who don't like white people, that's not.
It's not
racism. All right, well, I'm going to close out by reading the last paragraph of the testimony I prepared to say to City Council since we weren't allowed to. And again, we thank everybody who's watching on the live stream. Said, despite the FBI's newfound interest in recognizing the dangers of white supremacists to this country, we disagree with broadly labeling political ideology as terrorism. History has shown it will inevitably snap back on people of color, immigrants, Muslims, and progressive activists. As we did with Chief Outlaw, we urge Chief Lavelle, who has the discretion to accept or reject any case where the FBI asks for assistance, to err on the side of caution. The many organizations who objected to the PPV working with the FBI raised recent and long-term concerns about how the secretive federal agency tends to target vulnerable populations. And so again, we're going to thank you for watching today, and we're going to end the live stream, and we'll hope that you share this with your friends. Thank you.